Dear guests, dear audience, I would like to welcome you on behalf of Business Excellence of School of Economics and Business, Ljubljana University, of our Alumni Association, and of course, we will not be able to host this event without Institute Libertas. Welcome all, and of course, we are really honored to host Professor Friedman today, a well-known economist, writer, law, and other fields which will be described later. He will share his lecture today on a topic, market failure, an argument for and against government. Before we start, I'm kindly asking all guests to write your questions or comments directly on our YouTube channel, and we will try to answer or address your comments and questions later on and in the discussion, which will be led by Professor Aleksandar Kešeljević from the School of Business and Economics, Ljubljana. Before we start, I would like to invite Mr. Kai Jež from Institute Libertas to share some words with us. Kai, please.
Thank you very much, Masha, for giving me the opportunity to address our audience. Of course, thank you, Dr. Friedman, for taking the chance to partake in this online event. And of course, thank you to all of those joining us online in these very different times. Originally, this event was scheduled to take place earlier this year. All the arrangements had been made for Dr. Friedman to visit Slovenia for the very first time. However, this initial sort of planning took place just as the corona outbreak was reaching Europe. And eventually, due to circumstances quite outside our control, we were compelled to reschedule the event for another time. I'm very happy that that time has now come, albeit many changes have taken place and the event has taken on a different form. I am happy that perhaps this is the time when we are having a discussion on what market failure means, how market solutions can be implemented to solve the problems created by market failure, and what this means for the shifting paradigms in economic thought. I have no doubt that the past few months have seen events unprecedented, perhaps in all of human history, and it is likely that discussions on not only the minutiae of economic thought, but also grand paradigm shifting notions will become more and more relevant in the coming years. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Aleksandar Kešeljević from the Faculty of Economics, who has so graciously come to speak with Dr. Friedman at this event. I am very thankful that you have taken the time to listen to us. The Institute has been advocating for market-oriented and economically sensible policy in Slovenia for what has been almost 4 years now. And we have previously had the honor of hosting lecturers such as Bob Murphy, among others, during our Free Market Roadshow events. It is our hope that this is the first time Dr. Friedman addresses the Slovenian audience, but not the last. And we will be happy to make any arrangements for further visits to Slovenia later down the line. That is it as far as the address from my side is concerned. And I will now pass the word on to Dr. Friedman, and I'm very much looking forward to what I would know will be an excellent lecture.
Thank you, Kai. Please, Dr. Friedman, the floor or the screen is yours.
Thank you. My main disappointment in having to cut short my lecture tour in Europe was that I didn't get to visit Ljubljana, because it's a place I've never been before, and it sounded like quite an interesting place to go. So hopefully at some point in the future, when our present problems are more or less over, I will be able to come visit. That would be very pleasant. But I did prepare for the original talk a set of PowerPoints, and I decided the simplest thing would be to use those here as well. So I am now going to attempt, assuming I can work PowerPoint correctly, to do a share screen, which ought to show that. So my subject is market failure, and I'm going to argue that it is both an argument for government intervention in the economy, a legitimate argument, one whose economics are correct, but an argument against government intervention in the economy. I want to explain what market failure is, why it's an argument against laissez-faire, and why it is a stronger argument against the alternative to laissez-faire. It takes a candidate to beat a candidate, as they say. And what I will be claiming is that market failure is an exception on the private market, something that usually doesn't happen but occasionally does, but it is the norm on the political market where it normally happens. And I want to start out by making a point about the term market failure. And I also want to point out that market failure is relevant to a whole lot of things that aren't politics. The technical terms generally sound self-explanatory and often are not. And my standard example of that is the theory of relativity. I think there are a lot of people in the world who believe that they really understand the theory of relativity, except for the mathematical details, that the theory of relativity says everything is relative, and they understand that. And as any physicists in the audience will know, the theory of relativity does not say everything is relative. It turns out that the speed of light is quite impossibly absolute. And consequently, people make the mistake of thinking that the name of something tells them what it is. And the same thing is true about market failure. It ought to mean situations where markets fail. But in fact, there are ways in which markets can fail that are not due to market failure in the economist sense. And perhaps more important, there are market failure happens in lots of contexts other than markets. So what is market failure? I think market failure describes situations where individual rationality fails to produce group rationality, where each individual correctly acts in his own interest. It's not a matter of people making a mistake, but unfortunately, the result is that all of us are worse off. And the reason that happens is that I'm taking an act which helps me, but harms other people. Other people are doing the same thing, taking acts that help them, but harm me and other people. And the net result is that we are all worse off. Let me give you some brief discussion of examples that are not what we usually think of as markets. And my favorite example is to imagine that it's about 1,000 years ago. And usually when I tell this story, I say, and many thousands of miles east of here, but that's because I'm in America. And I don't have to do that for you because I want to imagine a medieval battle. And I presume that there were medieval battles in Slovenia, maybe a little less than 1,000 years ago, back when the Byzantine Empire, Venice, and whoever else was in the neighborhood were fighting over it. So imagine that you are one of 10,000 men in a line with spears, and your spears are all pointing in the same direction over that way. And the reason they're all pointing in that direction is that in that direction, there are another 10,000 men on horseback with spears, and they're coming at you. And you make a very quick cost-benefit calculation. You say, if we all stand our ground and keep our spears firmly planted, with luck, we can break their charge. And if we break their charge, some of us will die, but most of us will live. If we try to run, horses run faster than we do. I ought to stand. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I said we. I don't control him and him, the man on either side of me. I only control me. If everybody else stands and I run, one man out of 10,000 won't have much effect on the chance of breaking the charge, and I won't be one of the ones killed doing it. If everybody else runs and I stand, I'm dead. Whatever everybody else is doing, what I ought to be doing is running. Everyone makes that calculation, all of us run, and most of us die. Welcome to the dark side of rationality. Let me give you a couple of more mundane examples. And one of them is one that I actually observed every day when I was teaching at UCLA in the Los Angeles area. because just south of UCLA, there is an intersection of two very wide highways, which the locals claim is the busiest intersection in the world, or was, whatever, 40 years ago or so when I was there. And what happens in that intersection? Cars going one direction see the light beginning to change and they push ahead trying to get across the intersection. And the result is that when the light goes red, that intersection is jammed full of cars, which prevents the cars coming the other way from getting across. And gradually the cars filling the intersection manage to filter out, just in time for cars going at right angles to them on the other highway of the intersection to jam the highway that way and block the next round of it. If everybody was polite and waited to go into the intersection until he was sure he could get his car across, everybody would get home earlier. But any individual who did that would be worse off, because what he is doing is benefiting the people on the other highway at his own expense. Let me give you another example that probably all of you have experienced. You're in a restaurant talking with your friends. Unfortunately, the other people in the restaurant are talking with their friends too, and that makes the restaurant rather noisy. And since the restaurant's rather noisy, you have to speak a little bit louder so your friends can hear you. And of course, everybody else is doing the same thing, so you have to speak even louder. And you end up with everybody speaking as loudly as he can and nobody able to hear anybody. And it would be better for all of you if you all kept your voices down to a very reasonable level, as I'm trying to do at the moment. There are several sleeping people in my house as it happens, so I have a good reason to try to keep my voice down. But each individual correctly believes that it is his interest to speak somewhat louder. Right? So those are three fairly simple examples where the phenomenon of market failure, of individuals making the correct decision for themselves, but the wrong decision for the group as a whole, exists outside of what we usually think of as markets. There is a simple argument for freedom. And the simple argument for freedom is that each person acts in his own interest. Each being rational, makes decisions that maximize his net benefit minus cost. Economists generally assume people are rational, although I realize that not everybody agrees with that. Since each person is maximizing his benefit, that maximizes the total benefit. Therefore, we don't need government to intervene, and people will make the right decision by themselves. That's the argument, and at first glance, it sounds like a convincing one, but unfortunately, it's wrong. And what is wrong with it is the point I have just made, that sometimes I get the benefit of my act, and you get the cost. And that's true if I drive dangerously. The result is I get home faster, but I might dent your car or even kill you. It's true if I pollute the air, because I get to heat my house with a coal fire in London, back when London was subject to great, terrible fogs from the coal being burned in it back in the 19th century. Each of these cases, even though the total cost of what I'm doing is larger than the total benefit, I still do it because my cost is smaller than my benefit, and that's what economists refer to as negative externalities. You have the same problem in the opposite direction. You have the problem with good things as well as bad things. The problem with bad things is they happen when they shouldn't. The problem with good things is they don't happen when they should. So if you have a case where I pay the cost and you get the benefit, say a radio broadcast where I pay to put on the broadcast and other people get to listen, I do basic research and that increases knowledge which everybody uses. In cases like that, even if the total benefit is larger than the total cost, I may fail to do it. That's what's commonly referred to by economists as the public good problem. The fact that if you have a good where the producer can't control who gets it, the producer can't charge for the good, and therefore, even if it's worth producing, it doesn't pay him to produce it. Sometimes there are private solutions to these problems. There are some externality problems which can be dealt with by putting both parties in a single firm. So if you think about a shopping center providing a parking lot for customers is apparently producing a public good, that's free parking, but because it's free parking for people coming to the stores, and the owner of the parking lot is also the owner of the shopping center and is renting out those stores, and the rental value of the stores is higher if people can park near it. And in fact, you can imagine a shopping center doing a fairly elaborate job of coordinating externalities by trying to make sure that that there's a late night restaurant next to the movie theater, because the movie theater benefits the restaurant and the restaurant benefits the movie theater, and so forth. So that's similarly, if in my experience at least, shopping centers are usually cleaner and pleasanter than the outdoors, although the shopping center is private, not public. So that would be one example. Sometimes you can solve a public good problem by being sufficiently ingenious. And my standard example of that is one that I assume all of you have experienced. Certainly I have experienced. And that is, if you think about radio broadcasts, it's obvious from the economics that there are no radio broadcasts, or at least no private ones, because it costs something to make a radio program and you can't charge the users. But some unknown genius many years ago figured out the solution to that problem. And the solution is to produce not one public good, but two. One public good has a positive cost of production and a positive value to the consumer. That's the program. One public good has a negative cost of production and a negative value to the consumer. That's the advertising. It has a negative cost of production because somebody will pay you to put those ads on. Tie the two public goods tightly together and give away the package, and you can privately produce radio programs and television programs. It has been done for a long time. However, these are, as it were, special solutions which you can sometimes manage, but there is no guarantee that individual rationality in a market will always produce group rationality. It therefore follows from that there is a possible role for government, that a sufficiently wise and benevolent government could step in. It could improve the situation by regulating air pollution and dangerous driving, making us all better off by preventing acts whose costs are larger than their benefits. And it could improve the situation by subsidizing radio, television, and basic research, thus making us all better off by producing acts whose benefits are larger than their costs. That's the basic argument against laissez-faire for government. There is, however, a problem. The problem is that in order for this to work, you need some way of making the government actually make the right decisions. That after all, if we're thinking about the market, it isn't fair to say, we will just assume the market does the right thing. I've just explained why sometimes the market won't do the right thing. But we can't assume that for the government either. The government is not a benevolent God up in the sky reaching down to do good. It's made up of human beings, just like the market is. So in order for that to work, we need some mechanism such that it's the interest of the human beings who make up the government to make the right decisions. We need some way that the rational choices of political actors, voters, politicians, lobbyists, judges, bureaucrats, everybody in that system, add up to rational choices for all of us, just as we would like to have the market produce the same result. If we don't have such a mechanism, and I'm going to argue we don't, then government intervention could as easily make things worse as make things better, perhaps even more easily, since it's generally easier to break things than to fix them. And that brings us to the subject of market failure on the political market. Think about the way political decisions are made. Most political decisions are made by people who neither pay the cost of the decision nor receive the benefit. All right, the problem on the market is that sometimes a decision is made by somebody who doesn't bear all of the cost and gets all of the benefit, or does bear all the cost but gets only part of the benefit. But that's the normal situation in the political market. A voter who bears the costs of becoming well-informed is providing benefits in more intelligent voting that go mostly to other voters. A legislator who passes a bill is neither paying for it nor getting the results. A lobbyist is benefiting his customers at the cost of the taxpayers who he's getting the government to subsidize, or the consumers whose prices are higher because of a tariff or whatever. And judges make decisions and set precedents, almost all of whose costs and benefits will be borne by other people. So while there is not always a reason to expect the market to produce the right outcome, there is no reason to expect political actors to take the actions that maximize net benefit for all. To go into a little more detail on those, let's think of the phenomenon referred to by economists who apply economics to the political system as rational ignorance, the rationally ignorant voter. What I think of as the sort of naive theory of democracy is that the politicians have to do good things, otherwise we'll vote them out. And in order for that to work, the voters have to actually know what the politician is doing and what he ought to be doing. And that's not a trivial problem, especially in a modern society where governments are doing a huge numbers of things. From the standpoint of the individual voter, information is costly. It takes time and effort to figure out what the politician is doing. For some reason, no politician runs with the slogan, "I'm the bad guy." And when a legislator introduces a bill, in the US, for example, they have never, as far as I know, introduced a bill with the explanation that the purpose of this bill is to make farmers richer and city folk poorer, even though we have a farm program which is introduced every year whose purpose is that. So that means that in order to get the voters to do what they need to do for democracy to work, the voters have to go to the effort of figuring out not what the bills say they are, but what they really are, what politician voted for what bill, why, and so the rest of it. And they don't. I've done the experiment when I was teaching an undergraduate class in California at one point, asking the students, essentially all of whom are old enough to vote in the US, whether they knew the name of their congressional representative, and about half of them did. And it's real hard to keep track of what a politician is doing if you don't know his name. So if voters are rationally ignorant, they support policies that sound good to somebody who doesn't know very much about them. They have no incentive to learn more. And that gives you a politics of sound bites and demagoguery. I don't speak your language or read your language, and so I don't know much about your politics, but that certainly describes the politics I've experienced in my country. A second result is that you would expect that political institutions would have short time horizons. If you think about the question, it's an important question, of how do you get people to bear costs now in order to produce benefits in the future? And in order to do that, the person who bears the cost has to expect to get the benefits. This is the same issue I'm discussing with externalities in general. So think about it from the standpoint of a politician who does things that are politically costly now, that will provide benefits to his successor 20 years later, by which time he is out of office. He has very little incentive to do such things if he wants to stay in office. And if you actually watch what politicians are paying attention to, they're mostly interested in what the inflation rate or the unemployment rate is going to be at the next election, not what the effects of their policies are going to be 10 or 20 years down the road. Now, it's true that politicians claim to be interested in the future. That's because the voters can't see the future. So if you're doing something that the voters don't like, you can say, well, but this is just a sacrifice for the future. And you therefore can fool voters into accepting real costs now for imaginary benefits then. But given that the voters are rationally ignorant, the voters aren't going to know whether what you're doing is really producing benefits in the future or not. And my standard example of this tactic is its application by a very successful politician by the name of Joseph Stalin. He could not persuade Russians who were living one family to a room in Moscow, as some of them were, that things were good under his rule. But he could tell them that they were suffering now in order that their children would be richer than the Americans. And he could pull that off for a while. And doesn't work forever. Eventually people notice that it isn't really happening. But for some period of time, he could conceal the fact that his economic policy was actually a failure by pretending that it was a cost being borne for future benefits. What actually happens, as I said, is that politicians decide what to do, mostly by the effects on the next election. Indeed, I had a theory, which is probably not right, about the president of the US, Mr. Trump, that the reason he was setting up trade barriers with China was that he figured that a few months before the election, he would suddenly have a breakthrough negotiation with China. He would drop the trade barriers, and people say, isn't life wonderful? Things have just gotten a whole lot better. Sort of like the man in the insane asylum who hit himself over the head with a hammer, and when somebody asked him why, he said, it feels so good when you stop. But it's probably not true. I think I was exaggerating just how devious he was. Another example, and one which is fairly serious, is lethal caution in drug regulation. Think about the situation from the standpoint of an administrator in the FDA, which is the bureau in the US that approves medical drugs. And the question is, should he approve of a new drug? If it turns out that the drug has some unexpected lethal side effect, if it kills 20 people, he's out of a job. Suppose, however, that he delays the drug, he's trying to play safe. The result is that people die who would otherwise have lived. And typically that doesn't mean clear cases where you can point to who would have lived and who would have died. It means that the death rate is just a little bit higher than it would otherwise have been, but a 1% death rate change in a population of 10,000 people means 100 people who die instead of living. But there's no political cost to that because statistical deaths are invisible and voters are rationally ignorant. And my standard example for this is a press release from the FDA, if I remember correctly, in which they admitted to killing 100,000 people. That wasn't, of course, how they put it. It was the announcement that they had decided to approve timolol, which was a drug already being used for other purposes, to be used to prevent second heart attacks. It was already being used, I don't know about Slovenia, probably in Slovenia, but in much of the world for that purpose. And the FDA, for something like 10 or 12 years, refused to approve it. The FDA estimated that the use of timolol would save 8,000 to 10,000 lives a year. So that meant that by delaying it for something like 10 or 12 years, they had killed about 100,000 people. But as I say, that's not the way they described the press release. All right. So these are all examples of ways in which governments are subject to market failure on the political market. Let me give you a somewhat more general example. Suppose you're a politician and you're thinking about imposing a steel tariff or an auto tariff. And the beneficiaries, say an auto tariff is a better example. Beneficiaries are a very small number of auto companies, plus a union that represents the auto workers, about 5 actors in all, plus maybe the mayor of Detroit, which is a city that has a lot of auto companies, and maybe the governor of Michigan, which is the state Detroit's in. Those people can get together and they can say, if we get an auto tariff, that'll benefit all of us. How much will each of you chip in? And it's a small enough group so that they can, to some extent, solve the public good problem of getting the tariff. It's a public good problem for them, not for us. Public good problem for us is stopping the tariff. But from the standpoint of the beneficiaries, if they get the tariff, they all benefit. They can't control who benefits. But with a small number, they can arrange to raise money to, in effect, bribe politicians. So meanwhile, suppose the effect of the auto tariff is plausible, is that it benefits the auto companies by $20 billion and hurts their customers and export companies by $40 billion. Of the $20 billion, the auto companies and the union can probably raise something like $1 billion, $2 billion in money or in other useful political assets to lobby for the auto tariff. The nearly 300 million people who are made worse off by the auto tariff can't coordinate in that way and cannot raise anything like that amount. So one would expect that the usual pattern is that it is politically profitable to benefit concentrated and well-organized groups at the cost of dispersed groups, even if the cost is much larger than the benefit. Tariffs are not a random example. David Ricardo worked out the economics of foreign trade correctly about 200 years ago. One implication is that most of the time, a tariff hurts the country that imposes it, that is, the citizens of the country that imposes it. Nonetheless, from then till now, almost no countries have followed a policy of free trade, the exceptions being England in the 19th century, which was a very successful economy, and Hong Kong in the 20th century, which was a still more successful economy. Nonetheless, politically, a tariff is profitable, even though economically it's a loss. My conclusion then is that on the private market, individuals usually pay for what they produce, for what they use, and they usually get paid for what they produce. For a full explanation of that takes a semester or two of price theory, so I'm not going to try to reproduce it here. But there are sometimes situations where they don't. Those are basically the situations involving externalities and public goods and similar problems that economists write about. And therefore, market failure sometimes occurs. And sometimes things that get produced that shouldn't be, and sometimes things don't get produced that should. On the political market, individuals almost never bear the costs or receive the benefits of their actions, so they have no incentive to make those choices that maximize net benefits to all. Hence, market failure exists, but is uncommon on the private market and is common on the political market. And that explains why market failure theory does a better job of predicting political outcomes than it does of predicting market outcomes. That on the private market, radio and TV broadcasts shouldn't be produced since they are public goods, but in fact they are. Externalities shouldn't be controlled, but often are. Compare a large shopping mall, which is private, to a small town, which is public, which is cleaner and safer, usually, in my experience, the shopping mall. On the public market, the economic argument for protective tariffs is out of date by a couple of hundred years. Nonetheless, most countries have tariffs because they benefit the concentrated interest, the industry, at the cost of the dispersed customers. As Gary Becker, late Gary Becker, unfortunately, a prominent Chicago economist, pointed out, farm policy in countries that don't have very many farmers, that would describe most of Europe, is designed to raise crop prices to get the political support of the farmers at the expense of the consumers eating the food. It's true of the US as well as of Europe, I should say. Whereas in countries that have many farmers, farm policy is designed to hold crop prices down in order to buy the support of the urban mob at the expense of the dispersed farm population. And that's just the opposite of what you might expect from a democracy. You might say, well, in democracy, the politics will benefit large groups at the expense of small, but in fact, as the analysis of market failure on the public market suggests, it frequently is going in the other direction. Conclusion is probably fairly obvious at this point, that, just a minute, that market failure is indeed an argument for government intervention in markets. If we had available a government actor who was sufficiently wise and benevolent, it would be a legitimate, a correct argument. But it's a stronger argument against once one remembers to apply the same analysis to both, to treat both private and public actors as rational individuals seeking their own objectives, rather than simply assuming that one group will automatically do the right thing and the other group will not. Now, I have a few minutes left, so let me mention some other things that market failure is relevant to. One of them is how to win battles. And the answer is that the way you win a battle is to make it in the individual interests of the other side's soldiers to run away. If they run away, you don't have to fight them. And I suspect that if you really looked at battles, there's some early 19th century work on military history by a Frenchman called Dupica, military officer. He concluded that the normal dramatic story of a column charging a line and the two meeting and fighting doesn't really happen. What really happens is that at some point, either the line realizes the column isn't going to stop and runs, or the column realizes the line isn't going to break and stops. How do you run a firm? A firm has market failure problems internal to it because decisions made by individual workers or individual executives affect other people in the firm. So you want to try to design it as closely as you can so that the reward to individuals and groups within the firm corresponds to their contribution, which may involve dividing the firm into separate units and having some way of measuring the performance of each. My standard example from my own profession has to do with what I think of as the silent student problem, that I'm giving a talk and I say, all right, did everybody understand my explanation of the principle of comparative advantage? And nobody says anything. So I keep going, and only when I grade the final do I discover my mistake. And what's happened? Each student is saying to himself, well, I don't understand it, but probably most of the others do, and I don't want to look stupid to my fellow students, and I don't want to look stupid to the professor because maybe he'll give me a worse grade as a result. So everybody keeps his mouth shut. And I have a solution to this problem. I have to admit I'm a theorist, not an empiricist, so I haven't actually applied the solution, although I think some other people in other contexts actually have. But my solution was that you have your classroom set up so that at every seat, there is a button on the floor that you can unobtrusively push with your toe. And the screen at the back of the classroom shows how many buttons are being pushed. So I say, well, everybody who understood my explanation of comparative advantage, please push your button. And the number 3 appears on the screen, and I go back and explain it again. And I gather things like that are now being done using wireless devices rather than buttons at your toe, but the same basic principle. And my next example, another real one, is how you run a household. Sometimes my wife cooks dinner, sometimes I do. And imagine what doesn't have to be true in our household at the moment, that each of us does it half the time. And the question is, which of us should clean up? And usually when I'm having a more interactive talk, I stop at this point and try to see who in the audience can answer it. And usually somebody who actually has experience cooking can give me the right answer. And what I think is the right answer is that the cook is the one who ought to clean up each time, because when you're cooking a meal, you make a lot of decisions that affect how much cleaning up is needed. Do you arrange your dinner so that it all goes in one pot or in 4? Do you bother to wash one pot while another is coming to boil, or do you take a break at that point? If I'm the one who's going to clean up after cooking, I will take account in how I cook of how much work I'm making. That, by the way, is why we make small children clean up their messes. It's usually easier for the parent to clean up the kid's mess than for the child to do it. But if the parent always cleans up the mess, no reason for the kid not to make a mess. Now, I should say that the problem about cleaning up after dinner is to some extent solved by altruism. Conveniently enough, I love my wife and she loves me, so I give some weight to her welfare as well as to mine. But nonetheless, the fact that something you've done is making it harder to clean up is a lot more noticeable if you're cleaning up than if somebody else is. Finally, market failure is a profit opportunity. Market failure implies that there is some other outcome other than what's happening that on net is an improvement. An entrepreneur who figures out how to get that outcome might end up pocketing some of the gain. For example, whoever was the first person to think of combining advertisements with radio or television broadcasts. The first shopping center solved the externalities by putting many stores under one roof. Or Google, which thought of the idea of giving away a search engine in order to make money largely by pointing people at what to look at and being paid by the people they're pointing them Sorry, I went too far. Designing around market failure. My story about how you design around market failure, I'm running out of time, so I may not go much longer. Two Bedouins are riding their camel through the desert, and one of them starts complaining about how slow his camel is. The oasis they're heading for is a couple of miles away, and he says that his camel is the slowest camel in all the city of, in all of Arabia. And the other one says, you think your camel is slow? This snail I'm riding on is slower still. And they end up making a bet that whichever Bedouin's camel gets to the oasis last, the other Bedouin will owe him 1 golden dinar for losing the bet. So what happens? The first one goes slow, the second goes slower, because each one is trying to win the bet. And after an hour or two later, there are two Bedouins sitting their camels stock still in the blazing sun in the middle of the Arabian desert, with the oasis still a mile away. And at that point, a wise man comes by and he asks them, why are you two idiots sitting your camels stock still in the blazing sun in the middle of the desert with the oasis a mile away? And they get off their camels and explain the problem to him, that having made the bet, they're now stuck racing to be as slow as possible. And the wise man says 2 words, and the Bedouins jump on their camels and race to the oasis. And the question is, what are the 2 words? And I will let you think about it for a moment. Since we don't have a real live audience in its usual fashion, I can't find out whether any of you get it right, but the answer, of course, is trade camels. The bet was on which camel got to the oasis last, not which Bedouin did. So if I'm riding your camel, I want to go as fast as possible. And if you're riding mine, you want to go as fast as possible. So that's a sort of a neat example of how sometimes you can eliminate market failure by changing the way you're arranging things. For much more, my website is www.daviddfriedman.com. My blog is shown there, and there's a link to the blog on the website. I should say my website got very nicely redesigned a month or 2 ago by a girl who I think just had her 15th birthday, daughter of a friend of mine. One of the neat things about the online world is that you can get judged by what you can do and not by how old you are. So I think that finishes what I wanted to talk about. I can now shut down the PowerPoint, and here we all, at least some of us are. I think that finishes my talk, and now I gather I'm supposed to be interrogated and have everything I've said shown to be wrong by my friendly co-host.
Thank you, Professor Friedman, for your thoughts and your lecture. And now I'm kindly asking Professor Kešeljević to join us, to join me from, like I said before, School of Economics and Business, Ljubljana. I'm sure mostly you all know him. And please, like agreed, you will lead the further discussion with Professor Friedman. And we also received some questions and comments from the audience. And Professor Kešeljević will try to address them together with you, Professor Friedman, in the next words.
Okay, Professor Friedman, thank you very much for joining us today once again. Thank you for the opening presentation. I will try to put forward a couple of questions of starting points for a discussion before I will open the podium also for the others to participate in this discussion in vivo. So my first question would be, I'm sure that a lot of our today guests know you. However, they don't know you that your background is basically natural science. You have your master's in physics and your PhD in physics as well. And an interesting question or interesting point for me is when and why this switch happened from physics, from natural science to economics. When this happened, and has been economics a love at the first sight, patiently waiting for you to discover it, or it just happened lately as more as a hobby? Or we know your family background, we know the surrounding in which you were raised. So I think this is an interesting thing to start with. So transmission and maybe what we can learn from physics and from the natural science.
Yeah, I would say that the first question is why I started out going to physics and not economics. And the answer was that I did not want to spend my life being always introduced as my father's son. I was interested in economics very early on. I like to claim to have invented the concept of consumer surplus. Now, it is true that Alfred Marshall invented it a little bit earlier, but I did actually think it up in conversation with my father at one point. But I decided that since physics was something I was good at and something was obviously important and interesting, I would do that instead. And so my undergraduate major was chemistry and physics. I should say that I went to Harvard, and the family joke was that I couldn't take an economics course. They'd fail me because I'd give the right answers. But in fact, I got an undergraduate degree in chemistry and physics, and then a PhD at Chicago in physics. I then went to Columbia, and I was a postdoc for a few years. And at Columbia, I was interacting with people on the physics department, and they were people who were as smart as I was and considerably more interested in physics than I was. And at the same time, I was doing economics as a hobby. I was writing my first book. I did a piece on population economics for the Population Council, which was a private organization. The person who ran it noticed that everything being written about population was done from basically left of center, pro-government point of view, and thought it would be interesting to see something from the other side. I don't think those were his political views. He just was somebody in favor of seeing a wide diversity of ideas. So I wrote a piece, which is up on my website if people want to read it, called Laissez-faire in Population, the Least Bad Solution. That was at a time when population had the same role in the public discourse that climate has now. It was the looming catastrophe that we had to do something drastic to stop. And most people don't seem to have noticed that it turned out to be a wet firecracker, so far at least. So I was interested in economics, and I decided that it would be interesting to do it. And somebody who was running a semi-independent center at University of Pennsylvania, Julius Margolis, had seen something of mine, and he offered to find me a postdoc position at his center if I wanted to switch fields. So I accepted his offer. I was a postdoc at Penn for 2 years, and then a lecturer, I think, at Penn for 1 year. And during that, I wrote my first economics journal article, which was an economic theory of the size and shape of nations, in which I offered a general explanation of changes in the map of Europe from the fall of the Roman Empire to the present. That's also up on my webpage if people want to read it. I still think it was quite a neat article. Many years later, I came across somebody's article on the history of work on economics of size and shape of nations. The first article in that series was by me. The second was 10 years later by Jim Buchanan. And then there's at least one book, probably some more things since then. So it was a neat article, I thought. I had a lot of fun writing it. And at some point during those 3 years, I met Jim Buchanan, who was running the Public Choice Center at VPI at the time. And it was clear we had very similar ideas, that I was applying economics to try to understand the shape of nations. He and Gordon Tullock were in the process of inventing public choice theory. So Jim invited me to come to VPI as an assistant professor of economics, having taken no economics courses at all. His colleague, Gordon Tullock, unfortunately, neither of them is alive anymore, but Gordon Tullock I used to describe as the world's smartest 12-year-old. He was quite a delightful person with somewhat limited social skills, but a great deal of originality. When I remember when I got to VPI that Gordon used to claim that he had published more pages of economics than had been assigned in all of the economics courses he had taken. And I told him that I had achieved that with my first page. So I spent a fair number of years at VPI. I think, though I am not sure, that Jim Buchanan deliberately arranged for me to teach most of the syllabus over the course of those years, because teaching something is a good way of learning it. And I wrote articles and did stuff. And then since then, I've taught at a variety of other schools. And eventually, I got interested in economic analysis of law due to a controversy at Chicago between George Stigler and Gary Becker on one side, and Richard Posner and Bill Landis on the other, over an idea for sort of semi-privatizing criminal law. And I ended up writing 2 articles on that, one of which was a theoretical article showing that an insoluble problem that Landis and Posner has raised was in fact soluble, showing how you could solve it. And the other was a historical article looking at a real world society that had done more or less what Becker and Stigler had proposed, that being Saga period Iceland, because that was a society where if you killed somebody, his relatives sued you. And when they won and you didn't pay, they killed you. Because if you lost the case and didn't pay, you got outlawed, and it was legal to kill an outlaw. So that was really interesting, because that was more or less a real world example of what they were discussing, not exactly, but close enough. And at that point, Landis and Posner basically invited me to come argue with them at closer range. At the time I wrote that article, I was in the business school at Tulane. I was at Tulane because I had finally persuaded the lady I am now married to of the virtues of long-term contracting. She was she was a geologist and was working for Shell in New Orleans. So I got a position at Tulane so I could come join her. And so I spent some years in New Orleans, which is a very pleasant place to be about half the year. And the other half, it's 90+ degrees and 90+% humidity. And so I got invited to visit at Chicago, and I went to Chicago and spent about 10 years as a faculty fellow at Chicago on a 1-year appointment. Got extended. Eventually, it became reasonably clear that Landis and Posner were not going to persuade their colleagues that they needed another economist on the permanent faculty. And so I got a position in California and spent the next 20 or so years as a law school professor at Santa Clara University. And my most recent nonfiction book actually grew out of that Icelandic article, because it's a book on legal systems very different from ours that I published sometime in the last year, in which I look at a whole bunch of different legal systems, including the Icelandic one, but a lot of others, including Periclean Athens and Imperial China and Jewish law and Islamic law and Romany law and Amish law and so forth, and try to make sense of them, try to understand them. So I guess that's sort of more or less my professional history. I've also written some novels and done a bunch of other stuff. One of my hobbies is cooking from very old cookbooks.
Salamander is the novel, yes?
Salamander was my second novel. My first novel was called Harald and was actually commercially published by Bain. It wasn't successful enough for them to want to publish another one, so I self-published Salamander, which is actually a fantasy. Harald was marketed as a fantasy, but what it really is a historical novel with made-up history, whereas Salamander actually has magic in it, so that makes it a fantasy. And I've since published a sequel to Salamander called Brothers, and I'm at the beginning of working on a sequel to that, which may or may not ever get written. Okay. So I've got a fair range of interests, but going back to your question about physics, I like to say that the only thing I get from having a doctorate in theoretical physics for doing economics is that I can do non-mathematical economics without having people think I'm afraid of mathematics. And my view is that while mathematics is certainly useful in economics and many other things, it tends to get overused. That if you don't really have anything new to say, you can say something old with a new form of mathematics and make it sound as though it's doing something original. This had to do, I should say, for any economist or would-be economists in the audience. Ricardo distinguished between the extensive and intensive margin in agriculture. The intensive margin is trying to grow more wheat on a field where you're already growing wheat. And the extensive margin is bringing more land under cultivation. And there's an intensive and extensive margin in scientific research too. So in economics, the intensive margin is trying to say something new about a subject that smart people have been thinking about for 100 years. The extensive margin is finding someplace interesting where economics can be applied where it hasn't been. So I would describe Buchanan and Tulloch's work on public choice theory as a strikingly successful case of working the extensive margin, that what they were doing was taking the standard tools of economics and applying them to political system where they had not generally been applied. Similarly, Gary Becker, I should say Buchanan and Becker both got Nobel Prizes, so that's some evidence that it was a productive activity, but they also did interesting and important work, which doesn't perfectly correlate with whether you get prizes. And Gary Becker's work on economics of the family and economics of crime is the extensive margin. And my standard example of someone doing it now is Peter Leeson, who wrote quite an interesting book on an economic analysis of 18th century pirates, of the pirate industry and how the ships were run and why they were run that way and so forth. And he's done a number of other things. That's, I think, the only one that he's done a full book on, but he's written articles on all sorts of fun stuff. And Peter actually contributed one chapter to my book. He has a chapter on pirate law. But anyway, so for economists, I would suggest that looking, it's in a sense not the way you're normally pushed in graduate school. You're normally pushed into looking at whatever the current fashionable stuff is. And that has some professional advantages, but also costs. And the other is a lot more fun. When I was at UCLA, I should say, I ended up not getting tenure at UCLA. And I had a conversation with the chairman, and the chairman said to me, look, you're a bright guy. If you just followed the current literature and wrote an article on whatever the hot topic was, you would get the sort of CV that would get you tenure at a place like UCLA. And I said, yes, that's probably right. If you were me, would you do that? And he said, no. So it's more fun to do interesting things instead of to be the fifth person writing about whatever is the currently hot issue.
I agree completely, to do interesting things. I have one interesting question. I think it's an interesting question for you. We have, in the last 10 years, we have two structural breaks or two big events. One is big recession in 2008, 2009, and COVID-19, which we are in the middle of it. We are at the moment. Yes. So in both cases, government had huge intervention from the government side. If we ask ourselves who bailed out the banks to prevent even deeper crisis, then the answer is the government. If we ask ourselves who pumped the liquidity into the system or who stimulated the economy with the fiscal packages, the answer to all this question is the government. So what do you think from the position of the liberal economists as you are? Is government still part of the problem, or is it also a part of the solution?
Yes, certainly the government is part of the problem in the sense that a good deal of what set off the 2008 incident was the collapse of a market in which the two largest firms were government-created entities, that is Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which were sort of the major players in the mortgage market. But although I decided I was willing to take the risk of being an economist and identified with my father, I did follow a policy of avoiding macroeconomics, since that was what he was most associated with. And also I find that less interesting. So I try not to pontificate on things I don't understand. And I don't really adequately understand what happened in 2008 and why, beyond the obvious fact that it happened in something pretty far from a free laissez-faire market. With regard to COVID, I have thought about that a bit. And in fact, I think I've given at least one talk when I was looking at this sort of market failure issue in terms of contagious diseases. And it's clear that the individual incentives are not optimal, that I have an incentive to avoid getting the disease, particularly high incentive in my case because I'm old and male, and those are both risk factors for the disease. But I don't have an adequate incentive, because if I do get the disease, one of the costs will be that other people can catch it from me. And especially if I was 25 instead of 75, the risk to me of getting the disease would be quite low, maybe one chance in 1,000 of dying roughly. But if I got the disease, I could then spread it to lots of other people. So therefore, people will not always make the right decision. They will be less careful about avoiding the disease than they should be. On the other hand, governments also will not routinely make the right decision, and for the reasons that I discussed in my talk. And if I actually look at what happened in the course of this one, and I know it mostly from the US standpoint, of course, that's what I was observing. The government made a point of telling people not to wear masks. It is reasonably clear that the evidence to show that wearing masks reduced the chance that you would spread the disease to somebody else already existed before that. There's a blog that I read and participated in quite regularly called Slate Star Codex. The guy who runs it does a very good job at looking at a bunch of scientific articles and sort of summarizing and critiquing them. And back early on in the COVID business, he had one on the subject of masks, and the conclusion there was that one couldn't be sure exactly how big the effect was, but that they clearly had a substantial effect on preventing transmission and probably some effect, although smaller, on keeping you from getting it. Nonetheless, the government told people not to wear them. The US government forbade the use of tests other than the ones that they were producing, and then eventually admitted that the ones they were producing didn't work. And that's at a point when there were other tests available because they were being used elsewhere in the world. So in both of those cases, the US government, I think, substantially contributed to making things worse. There were some detailed cases as well, as you may know, in New York, possibly other places as well. The instructions were given that when elderly people who were in old folks' homes got the disease, they should be sent back to the old folks' home. The theory being that they were worried about the hospitals being overcrowded. But of course, since the people most vulnerable to disease were the people in the old folks' home, that particular decision resulted in killing a whole lot of people because it spread the disease to the most vulnerable population. And in fact, in my view at least, probably the correct decision, if you had had a perfectly wise government, would be to isolate people who are either old or have serious medical problems, and let other people, let the disease spread through other people, trying to slow it down enough so you didn't overload your hospital system, and keep that up until you got herd immunity, until enough people, if, as we hope is the case, is probably but not certainly the case, getting the disease makes you immune for a fair while thereafter, which is the typical case for diseases, though we can't be certain it's true, that you could then let herd immunity develop, at which point the rest of us could come out. And I should say I acted on that principle, that I was persuaded by my younger son that it was a mistake to continue my speaking trip. I concluded that my reluctance to terminate the speaking trip was an example of the difference between crystallized intelligence and fluid intelligence, that fluid intelligence is looking at a new problem and finding the solution. Crystallized intelligence is using your solution from last time. I'd done lots of speaking trips. I had never faced a disease problem that was sufficiently serious to make me cancel it, so I knew the answer to that question. And eventually I realized that's what I was doing. I think people tend to switch towards crystallized intelligence as they get older. And so I rethought it and realized my son was right and canceled your talk and the one in Prague. I couldn't have gotten to Prague. It now turns out they would have closed, they closed the border, I think the day before I was scheduled to fly in, and flew home instead. I got home on March 13th. That was a little over 3 months ago. And I have not been more than about 10 feet from my own property since then. So I chose to self-quarantine.
We have one question from the undergraduate students from Erasmus. What is your opinion about universal basic income as a libertarian economist?
I understand. The answer is, if you could somehow persuade people to make the contract that there would be some simple program for transferring money to poor people, and all policies justified as helping the poor would then be ruled out of bounds. So you would not have all of the other things done with the claim they help the poor, which include things like the farm program, which pretty clearly does not help poor people on average, since most farmers are not poor. But one of the justifications for it is there are poor farmers who, if you don't hold up the price of grain, will be forced off their farms. Similarly for a lot of other proposals. So if you could somehow make a social bargain in which you had negative income tax or universal income or something of that sort, and nothing else, that would probably be a gain. I don't think it would be a gain over not having any of those things. It would be a gain over what we actually have. But if you actually do the arithmetic for a universal basic income, you discover that to make it financially practical, it would have to be at a level sufficiently low so that nobody who's in favor of it would be happy with it. That people who talk about it are usually, if you think about, I think the proposal that one Democratic candidate was making was $1,000 a month, if I remember correctly. And $1,000 a month for 300 million people is $300 billion a month, $3.6 trillion a year. And that, I think, is more than the entire federal budget, if I remember my numbers correctly. And yet $12,000 a year is not a very comfortable income to live on in the US. So I think most of the people who support the idea haven't done the arithmetic. And they're sort of saying, wouldn't it be nice? And it would be nice if everybody knew that he could live at a sort of a modest level, and their view of modest level is probably a good deal more than that. If they didn't work, and then people could work if they wanted to. And they haven't realized that the kind of level they want is more than the amount of money available would be. Now, as you may know, my father proposed a negative income tax a long time ago, and that's in the same general spirit. It's mechanically a little different, but almost all of these systems can be made equivalent to each other by what you assume about the actual structure of the taxes. But his argument, again, was that you would like it as a replacement for all of welfare, not as an additional thing to tack onto it.
Okay. Since you have elections in November, Biden or Trump? I mean, which one is the least bad from the libertarian standpoint and position?
From my standpoint,
who will do less harm from economic policy?
I would have said that the two tolerable results are that Trump gets elected and the Democrats keep control of the House, or that Biden gets elected and the Republicans keep control of the Senate. As far as I can tell, Biden and Trump are both terrible people to be president for rather different reasons. That the amount of damage they can do is limited if the other party controls at least one house of the legislature. That I think Trump with both houses would do a few good things because he's on the right side of a few issues, but a bunch of bad things. Biden with both houses would probably do almost nothing good except maybe immigration and lots of bad things. So now Biden is probably less bad than the other most of the other Democratic candidates, but that's damning with faint praise from my standpoint. And Trump is not less bad than other possible Republican candidates, but there's no serious chance that there will be another Republican candidate unless Trump drops dead or something close to that, which is not very likely to happen. So I would say I don't have a strong opinion between those options. I guess, probably Trump plus the Democrats holding at least one house maybe is a little better than the other one, on the grounds that most of the damage Trump can do he's already done. We sort of have a fairly, I guess I'm conservative in the sense of sort of better the devil you know than the devil you don't know. And Trump is definitely at this point the devil we know. His two biggest policies are ones where he's on the wrong side, namely immigration and trade. On the other hand, the Democrats historically haven't been very good on those issues either. At the moment, the Democrats are all in favor of immigration because Trump's against it. And they're all in favor of free trade because Trump's against it. But I'm not all that confident that if they were actually in power, they would act that way, though one can hope.
Besides immigration policy and trade policy regarding the tariffs, it's also the third one. Trump abolished the Paris Club Agreement. How do you see?
I'm in favor of that.
You're in favor of that? Okay.
Oh, yes.
Can you explain what is your
thought
to begin with,
to begin with, the Paris Agreement doesn't really do anything if you look at it. There are no enforceable terms. But beyond that, my view on global warming is that global warming due to humans is almost certainly correct. That is, it's clear that global temperatures have trended up in the last, since about 1911, so roughly the last century. That the reason is greenhouse effect due to CO2 strikes me as the most likely explanation. Climate is a very complicated system, so it wouldn't be absolutely astonishing if it turned out the reason was something else, but I don't think it's very likely. I should say, as you may know, how sensitive temperature is to CO2 is not known. That basically estimates of the relevant factor, basically how much temperature goes up if you double CO2, range from about 1 to 3. So it's if the real number is the very low end, it could be that something else is responsible. But I don't think that's the way to bet. My guess is that the conventional explanation is correct. What I think is wrong is the conventional statement about the consequences. That basically you have climate change indeed has external effects, but it has both positive and negative external effects. And if, as far as I can tell, all of the talk involves looking only at the negative effects and making generous estimates of them and ignoring mostly the positive effects. And if you try to look at both, it's not at all clear whether increasing CO2 is a net positive or a net negative. In particular, the one effect we are most certain of is CO2 fertilization. CO2 is an input to photosynthesis. There's been lots of experimental evidence of the effect on crops of increasing CO2 because people do it in greenhouses to deliberately increase yield. It turns out that doubling CO2 concentration increases the yield of most crops by about 30%. So you're talking about a huge positive effect in terms of food production. The exceptions are maize and sugarcane, or it increases them, but probably by less. It turns out there are two different mechanisms for photosynthesis, and most crops use one, and maize and sugarcane use the other. So that's one example of a large effect. Similarly, if you actually look at the sea level effects, they are really very small. That the figure for the East Coast of the US, I came across a book that had the numbers, is that if you raise sea level by a foot, the coastline moves in by about 100 feet. Well, if you look at the most recent IPCC report, the fifth report, the high end of its estimate for the end of the century was about 1 meter of sea level rise. So at least in the US East Coast, that moves the coastline in by 100 meters. That's almost invisibly small. Now, there are places that it's worse. As far as I can tell, the worst place is not Bangladesh, which everybody talks about, but the Nile Delta. And a meter will actually flood noticeable parts of the Nile Delta, assuming you don't dike. But after all, the Dutch have been diking against much higher sea level problems for centuries, and they've done it with much less advanced technology than we now have. So I think if you look at it, sea level rise is it's a fairly small problem. At the same time, if you think about human use of the globe, human habitation is restricted by cold, not by heat. The equator is populated. There are a few places that are too hot, deserts and such, but the equator is populated, the poles are not. If you raise temperatures, greenhouse warming, for well understood reasons, physics of which I could explain if you were curious, tends to be greater in cold places and times than in warm places and times. It has to do with the interaction with water vapor. And that means that you're going to get the largest effect in warming places like northern Norway and Canada and Siberia. And as best I can tell, you're going to get an increase in usable land due to the temperature contours moving towards the poles that's at least a couple of orders of magnitude larger than the loss of land from sea level rise. So those are two examples, and one could go into others. And I'm not saying that I'm sure the effect is positive. What I'm saying is that as far as I can tell, there are both positive and negative effects. We don't know enough to even sign the sum, and everybody is talking as if we knew that the effect was negative and large. And I should say this is essentially, I mentioned earlier my first article on population growth. And that was basically that article what I tried to do in that article was to estimate the net externality from having one more child. And I concluded that I couldn't tell if it was positive or negative. And everybody who was talking about it was just looking at the negative effects. And in that case, the evidence is that I was right.
Okay, we have two last questions from the audience.
Sure.
The first one is, what is China doing right from the aspect of non-liberal economy? So what China is doing right?
Well, I guess that depends relative to what? Relative to what China was doing 50 years ago, what they're doing right is abandoning socialism. And that was an enormous improvement. You're talking about something like a 20-fold increase in per capita income over the period since Mao's death, maybe more by now. And what they're doing wrong, as far as I can tell, the present premier or president, or whatever they call him, mistakenly believes that what you need is a sort of managed capitalism, which the government makes lots of decisions. That's what I would think of as a very mildly fascist, economically speaking, point of view, not nearly as extreme as, say, fascist Italy was. But so relative to Mao, they're doing things very, very much right. I've been in Shanghai and a couple of other places in China, and I thought that Shanghai was a very pleasant place, happy city. And as far as I could tell, Shanghai was not a whole lot less capitalist than the US. It was, in fact, my conclusion was that it was probably a little less capitalist on paper and a little more capitalist in reality, that there were more regulations, but people mostly got bribed not to enforce them. But Shanghai, I think, is more capitalist than most of China, as far as I can tell. So they've got, I think they've made very large improvements, but they're still, they're a tyrannical society. They are engaged in what looks like pretty indefensible behavior towards their Muslim minority. And they are engaged in trade restrictions. Now, the US is also engaged in trade restrictions, unfortunately. And of course, China is also in the process of clamping down on Hong Kong. In a sense, one of the best things that I've seen happen in recent years was the Prime Minister of England, in effect, offering the people in Hong Kong an exit. And I actually proposed that before he did it. I proposed it for the US. I thought the US ought to simply announce that anybody from Hong Kong who wanted to migrate to the US was welcome to do so. I think that would have benefited us as well as them. And it would have made the point that, in a sense, the ideal way of fighting tyranny isn't with guns, it's by walking, by simply leaving, by voting with your feet. And I think that makes China look bad. It makes us look good. I wish the US had done it, but I'm happy that the UK seems to be doing it. Okay. So I think that clamping down on China, on Hong Kong, is a great mistake. So I can't think of anything they're doing right that is an improvement on what they were doing 20 years ago, say, when Deng was still the leading figure there. And I can't think of anything they're doing which is clearly better than what other developed countries like the US are doing. But on the other hand, they're doing a whole lot less wrong than they were under Mao.
Mm-hmm. Okay, the last question will be put forward by Kai, who initiated this meeting and today's lecture and invited Professor Friedman. So please, Kai, go ahead.
Thank you. So I have both a not exactly a correction, but a notification and a question to pose. The first would be to be cautious when recommending your work on the Slate Star Codex, because I believe as of yesterday, due to a dispute with the New York Times, the Slate Star Codex is no longer accessible. So you might want to think about backing up the work you did there. And secondly, I would also like to pose a question regarding your initial lecture, which is a question that I'm sure has been on many people's minds, which is, what then? So we discussed about market failure and why there is the argument for government intervention. And we discussed about how government intervention is also subject to market mechanisms that make said intervention potentially more problematic than it is a solution. Now, there's been several sort of experimental governance suggestions, or even, let's say, reactionary government suggestions. For instance, Hoppians tend to see monarchy as an effective solution to many of the problems you listed. So what is your view on how we solve the many problems created by those incentives that are created through government intervention?
Yes, well, as you probably know, my preferred solution is anarchy, that is a private property society in which all useful government functions are provided privately. On the other hand, I'm not going to claim that that will work under all possible circumstances. If you read my book, The Machinery of Freedom, preferably the third current edition, I discuss under what circumstances the institutions I'm recommending might fail to work, might break down for various reasons. Beyond that, I doubt that there isn't a real answer to your question. That is, I doubt that there is a set of institutions that for all societies in all circumstances works. That I mentioned the book that I wrote on legal systems, very different from ours. And the question people often ask me is, what's the best legal system? And my answer is, I don't think there is one. That I think that what institutions are going to work is going to vary a whole lot according to the environment the society is in, the features of the society, and so forth. Monarchy at first seems sort of tempting as a solution to the long-term planning problem, because the argument is that the monarch wants things to be good, not only for himself, but for his children and his grandchildren, and therefore takes account of long-term effects. On the other hand, my younger son, whose interests are historical, likes to point out that if you actually look at the history of the British monarchy, there's, I don't remember his exact statement, but something like no period of more than 2 reigns when there wasn't some sort of a civil war or succession struggle of some sort within that monarchy. So although in principle, monarchy could solve that problem, in practice, most systems of monarchy seem to have conflicts over succession. For people who are interested in the subject, I recommend an old historical novel by Mary Renaud called The Praise Singer, which is set in ancient Greece. And it describes 3 different tyrannies, where tyrant in ancient Greece was not a negative term. It basically meant a popular dictator. And one of the tyrannies, the tyrant is corrupt but competent. And in order for him to be rich, his island has to be rich so that he can skim off enough for himself. And when he dies, it's a catastrophe. One of them, the tyrant is competent and benevolent, and that's good. And he dies and his sons take over, and they are neither competent nor benevolent, and things gradually slide downhill. So it's sort of an interesting portrait, which I think makes a legitimate point that a dictatorship of some sort or a monarchy can be a pretty good system if you're lucky, but it can also be a pretty bad system. So I think the only system that I'm willing to make serious arguments for is the stateless system, and that's not always going to work either.
Thank you very much for your time, Dr. Friedman. If our colleagues from the University of Ljubljana would like to say anything else, they are welcome to. But once again, on behalf of the Libertas Institute, it has been an honor and a pleasure to host you. And if you're ever in the region again, we will be happy to offer you the chance to visit.
I expect to be in the region at some point again, but you will have to tell me when the present pandemic is going to cease being a problem before I can tell you when I can come. We
are open for tourists. We were, in fact, the first country in Europe to declare ourselves free of the epidemic.
Yes, I understand that. It might even be true. But getting to you will involve flying on airplanes with lots of other people. And I have, as I say, I've been literally staying essentially on my own property now for over 3 months because I don't want to take that risk. You should take that risk, but
you know what is a recipe is like an example of the case of the soldiers. Just burn the bridges behind, and then you will come here.
So Professor Friedman, thank you also on behalf of School of Economics and Business, University of Ljubljana. Thank you, Professor Kešeljević. Thank you, Kai and Libertas Institute. And thank you all the audience, of course. We are looking forward to host you again to prepare some new events for you, new topics, new lectures. And until then, follow us on cpoef.com or .c and of course, webpage of Alumni. Thank you all and
thank you.
Have a nice afternoon.
Uh-huh.